Never go backwards.
All right. Well, Guy, what I'll do is I'll just reframe that question, and I'm not going to do the intro again. I'll just use what I had.
Fine. You can splice that in, sure.
Yeah, totally. Okay. So I'll just reframe that first question and then I can. Okay. So you came to Quebec for the National Theatre School after a childhood split between Vancouver and Australia, and quickly found you didn't fully belong to either the Francophone or the historic Anglo world. How did that early question of where do I fit in here shape your work?
Well, the question of where do I belong actually preceded my arrival in Quebec. When I was 12 years old, for reasons that were totally random, my parents one summer sold their house, bought tickets on a boat to move to Australia. And even though Australia speaks the same language as Canada, more or less, g'day, mate. There was a culture shock, a surprising amount of culture shock in being the outsider, being the foreigner. And even though my younger brothers quickly became full Australians and they still live there, I never quite fit in. So when I finished university, I just headed off somewhere and I bought a one-way ticket to Berlin. Just it seemed exotic, it seemed like a place to go. But when I arrived in Canada visiting relatives, I saw an ad for a brand new playwriting course at the National Theatre School of Canada in Montreal. So as I was visiting relatives, I wrote a play, delivered it to Montreal, and then phoned them later in the summer from Dublin, and I was accepted. It was a total surprise. But oddly enough, I arrived in Montreal at the age of 26, and within a couple of weeks, it felt more like home than any place I'd ever been, at a sort of mega level. Now, at a micro level, the National Theatre School was a bicultural institution. So half of the students were French, half of the students were English. This is 1980. So this is immediately after the first referendum. It's a particularly volatile, politically charged moment in history, to which I'm almost entirely oblivious. We didn't get a lot of Canadian or Quebec Jews in Australia. So I found myself in an environment where you have all of these attractive young people kind of avoiding one another for political reasons. And the Francophone kids, for the most part, could speak English, but chose not to inside Quebec for political reasons. And most of the English kids, they had a little bit of English they'd learned at school, but not enough to really communicate. So I was just mesmerized by the passion, the politics, the history. And so from the beginning, I realized I'm never going to be part of this Francophone community, really, because the enemy is people who speak English, and that kind of includes me. And yet I also realized that I didn't have the roots to really understand or to be part of the English-speaking community. So I've been an observer for decades, observing, loving both crowds, but seeing how they clash, they misunderstand one another. And so where do I fit in? Where do we all fit in? These have been major questions, and I've always talked to people about their own sense of belonging for all of those decades in Quebec.
Right. That's so fascinating. And like you started up a LAN, right? Like to, and the Quebec Writer Federation, the Drama Federation. What pulled you to the institutions and then helped you kind of start telling the story of what you were observing on the ground?
Well, again, the story is multi-stranded. I mean, I studied playwriting at the National Theatre School, so I was interested in storytelling. I'd been a songwriter before that, so storytelling was always something that fascinated me. And coming out of the National Theatre School, I worked on a number of major multimedia shows. Like I wrote The History of Canada, projected onto the Parliament buildings in Ottawa. I wrote all of the content for the Canadian World Fair in 2000. In Montreal, when they opened the Pointe-à-Carrière Museum in 1990, a friend of mine wrote the history, and I translated it for the English version. But then when they redid it 10 years later, they had complaints that it was too Franco-centric, so they wanted somebody with an outsider's perspective to rewrite the history. So I wrote that one that was in place from 2000 to 2010. So So storytelling has always been part of my interest. But when I graduated from theater school, there were very few Anglo artists in Quebec. That was like the tail end of the exodus. There were very few institutions, and creating institutions as a base of support, of mutual aid, of a way of interfacing with the Francophone majority became a sort of survival plan, a strategy for better integrating into Quebec. So that became such a big part of my life, especially after Elan, that my creative side was kind of put on the back burner for a number of years. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And you had this documentary then around COVID that you'd put together. I watched it, and it's really powerful. I love that stories are getting recorded, that history of through, an art form that we're recording and maintaining those. So what we choose to remember sets out to celebrate how Anglos and Allophones adapted in the spirit of Bill 101 that was, over 50 some odd years ago. I was so surprised to hear that the people that have been here the longest feel less of a belonging as to the younger people that have been here perhaps a little less time. How does that dynamic work, Guy?
Yeah, that surprised me too. I mean, for your listeners who've not seen the film, although if they want to see the film or read the book, they could simply go to whatwechoose.ca where they're freely available. But the film, just to back it up one step, as I was sort of planning to go back to becoming a writer and a filmmaker and leaving Elan, the Secretariat for Relations with English-speaking Quebecers was doing some research into the sense of identity and belonging amongst English speakers in Quebec, and found, to nobody's real surprise, that very few English speakers have a strong sense of, I'm an Anglo-Quebecer. They have a sense of their family, their neighborhood, their work, many things, but they're not Anglo-Quebecers first and foremost. And many don't have a strong sense of belonging in Quebec. They have a stronger sense of belonging in their neighborhood, and also to Canada than to Quebec. So there was this opportunity the Secretariat wanted to fund some projects. And because, I've been a filmmaker, the way for me to approach that was to make some short films. And when you're talking about an English-speaking population in excess of 1 million people, and you're making, even a feature-length documentary, you're interviewing maximum a couple of dozen people, maximum. So who do you choose to be representative of that story, that complexity? And that's where the idea of approaching it from the perspective of waves of integration. So a family that arrived immediately after the conquest has a different sense of belonging, a different sense of ownership than a family that arrived after the Second World War, or somebody who arrived as a student in the 21st century. And that proved to be quite an effective way of telling the story, because even though we couldn't possibly touch on every single immigration group, every language, every country, every religion, people who arrived during the same period could say, yes, that was what it was like when we arrived. That was the social, political climate when we arrived, and I identify with that. So that's sort of a long-winded preamble to answer your question. That what it appears is that the earlier waves, the families that have been here for a long time, they've been hammered, they've been pushed around, they've been devalued, they've been mistreated, they've been made to feel unwelcome. Whereas the more recent, the post-1995 immigrants haven't experienced that. They've had prior to Bill 96. So we'll talk about that. My film was made just prior to Bill 96. But sort of post-95 and then prior 96, they had an overall positive experience. And so their sense of belonging to Quebec, precisely, was in general higher than families that had arrived after the Second World War or like way, way, way back, which was surprising. And yet, in a weird kind of way, it makes sense in terms of the turbulent historical period we've been through. And, that explains also the massive exodus of hundreds of thousands of people. Why did they leave? Well, they didn't leave because they felt welcome.
Right. Totally. I mean, I found that quite revealing when that came up. I loved at the end where the people that you were interviewing were putting up a 1 to 10 on how much they felt like they belonged.
Yeah, they showed their hands, which is very, very visceral way of expressing it, and the expressions on their face and the body movement and the choice of the fingers. It's extremely powerful, and all of them do it. And then the last person is a woman whose family arrived in the 1820s. She's in her 80s, and she thinks about it for a minute, and then she boldly thrusts all 10 fingers in here. This is my home.
Yeah, with a beautiful smile and like, I'm not messing around. I love that.
The number of audiences that practically stood up and cheered when she did that. Yes, we also should be reclaiming our place here. This is our home too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Guy, what were some of the most revealing things that came out of those interviews? Because like you said, you interviewed like a plethora of different, people that were coming in or had been here for a long time, coming in with their own cultures. Like, what did the documentary reveal to you as, a citizen here in Quebec?
Well, the documentary is 93 minutes long, so it's a fairly superficial overview. I mean, it touches on a lot of things, but the book, for example, there's an English-speaking population in the Gaspé, and I knew that there were many towns, but what I didn't realize was how deep the roots were. I mean, I wonder how many of your listeners know where the first English school in Quebec was established after the conquest. And I'm sure that most people don't know it was in Gaspé town. And that's because during all of the violence, that entire Gaspésian coast was depopulated. And when it was repopulated, it was from fishermen from the Jersey Islands and from Britain and American royalists. And so Gaspé, in the year of the first census, was 75% English-speaking. Now, how many people know that? And so there's this long and deep English history in the Gaspé that I kind of began to discover in the film, and then really discovered when I could explore it in more depth when I was, touring the film and writing the book. And similarly, when I think of Rouyn-Noranda, I think of a town that is French and is a mining town. But it was originally two towns. Noranda was the company town, and it was largely, at least 50%, actually in the first census, it was 67% English or Anglophone, and only a third were French-speaking. And there are institutions there. We showed the film in a space called Le Petit Théâtre. There was a sort of a new marquee in wood, but behind the marquee, carved into the stone, it says Remembrance House, 1948. And so there are all of these traces of deep English-speaking roots around the Quebec. And so the film opened up all of that to me, and certain small places that I just had no idea existed.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And then did the film then inspire the book to keep digging into these stories? Because I love this. So the film is remember, and the book is forget, right? What we choose to remember, what we choose to forget. How did the film inspire the book? And what did it reveal that, again, was like, wow, like there's a lot going on here that a lot of us don't know about?
Well, I released the film in May 2022. It was the opening film at the Hudson Film Festival. June 2022 was when the CAQ passed Bill 96. I mean, normally for a documentary film, there's a national and international film circuit that you hop onto and away you go. But my film was really about Quebec, and I really wanted to show it in Quebec. And because I had been executive director of Elan, and I'd been involved with many community organizations, I had a lot of friends and connections around the province. So I asked them, would you be interested in showing this film in your communities? Because of the inherent interest in the subject matter of the film, but also in the added context of Bill 96 and needing to hear something positive about Anglos, everybody wanted to see it. I showed it to 60 communities around Quebec, which is unheard of. And another thing that I discovered there that I had never really thought about is that my film approached the Anglo story, the Anglo-Allophone story in terms of waves of immigration. But I realized as I was traveling around that the very old towns are on water. They're along the St. Lawrence Valley or its tributaries or the lakes. So when I would come into a town that has these deep, deep roots, like St. Andrews on the Ottawa River in the Lower Laurentians, now called Saint-André d'Argenteuil, that's where Sir John Abbott was born. And it's the mouth of the La Rivière du Nord. You go up the river a little bit and you come to St. Columban, which was the first Irish settlement in 1810. So I got a sense of the layers of settlement. And then you come to railroads and bridges. The Victoria Bridge opens up the South Shore. So the first station is St. Lambert, a storied history, and then the suburban railway, the Southern Counties Railway, opens up the South Shore to the working class. And then you get places like Greenfield Park being populated. So the layers of settlement based upon the modes of transportation. And that's the way I structured the book. Each section is like you travel through this region, first by water, then by rail, then by road, and discover all of the villages and the history. And it was just infinitely more detailed than I had imagined. And as I'm showing the book to people, even lifelong Quebecers who are my age, you're going, wow, like I did a lot of this stuff I had no idea about.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And through the book, like, it starts to open up this idea of Bill 96. Guy, could you kind of give us like what that meant to Anglophones and Allophones within Quebec when that bill came in? Like, it was a pretty big seismic shift that was starting to happen when that bill came in. Is that accurate to say?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I mean, Bill 96 was in many ways as much of a seismic shift as Bill 101. The difference being that in the 1960s and the 1970s, there were documented serious social and economic injustices. The Francophone majority, unilingual Francophones earned less than unilingual Anglophones, which is, just wrong. And so, and it was hard to find work in English. It was hard to be served in English. I mean, there were a lot of reasons for the Francophone majority to be upset. Now, one of the messages I was trying to get across in my film was that the Anglos and Allophones who either chose to stay here or who arrived during that period bought into what we might call the spirit of Bill 101. Yes, there are injustices. Yes, we want to live in a more just society. Yes, it's important for us to speak French. So, most people who learned bad French or minimal French in high school made considerable efforts as adults for their professional and personal lives to learn French, to be able to, socialize and communicate professionally. And what I'm also discovering in a side project that I'm working on is that most of those people, those boomers and Generation X people who struggled with French, went to great lengths to ensure that their kids had a better start. Immersion classes, any summer camps, Francophone babysitters, whatever. But, it was a serious thing. So the film was about, yes, we've contributed. This is a great place and we should all be proud of ourselves. And our Francophone neighbors should recognize the role we've played. And then Bill 96 says, no, that was a failure. That was a disaster. We're 2 eager signs away from becoming Louisiana. And at first there was confusion, like, can this be for real? Like, is this really? And then it was kind of sadness. And I remember a screening in Ormstown when a woman in the audience said, my family was one of the founders of this region. We founded the first apple orchard, and we're going to be celebrating our 200th anniversary in a few years. And we wonder if this CAC government would like to help us celebrate, or if they would like to help us pack our bags and leave. And nobody in the room stood up and said, hey, now that's crazy talk, because people were feeling sad. They were feeling confused. They were feeling unloved. And as it went on, and the whole attack on education and the cégeps and the universities and too much English in the streets, then people started becoming, angry, annoyed and angry. And by the time I was into 30 screenings, halfway into, a year and a half into Bill 96, it became clear that what I was witnessing was a multifaceted face of Anglophone, Allophone Quebec during a time of transition/crisis. It was important for us to understand, and it will be important for people in the future to remember And it's also important for our Francophone colleagues to see this, to see what we were experiencing. Because one of the weird things about Quebec is that a politician can always say the French language in Quebec is fragile. We need to do something to protect it. And the Francophone majority will always say, quite rightly, yes, yes, protect us. But Bill 96 was about attacking and diminishing and belittling to minorities, in many cases to little or no benefit to French language or culture. And that's what I think the Francophone majority, for the most part, didn't understand. I mean, as the CAC became, and as they demonstrated that their bullying techniques and their lack of data, their lack of documentation, they're following a feeling and then bullying it through. The rest of the population started to see how they worked and then could kind of understand that maybe they applied the same treatment to English speakers and to immigrants.
Interesting. It's so fascinating. Like, we don't hear these stories enough. And it brings me to your book as well of what we choose to forget. What are some of the things that we're forgetting as well? Like, how do we have to keep this history alive so that we don't forget?
Well, yes. I mean, the film Choose to Remember, we can choose to remember many positive things we've done together. That was my hope, to establish a piece of film that could be screened by Anglophones, Francophones separately or together, and encourage a positive conversation. The book, What We Choose to Forget, I mean, this is about erasure. This is about deliberate cancellation. It's about a deliberate process of ignoring or denying the history and the contributions of a group of people. And if you just take Montreal, I mean, if you go back to 1760, the year that Montreal capitulated to the British Army, what is left from that Nouvelle France period in Montreal? Well, the short answer is not very much. You're talking about half a dozen buildings. I mean, even Notre Dame Church was built nearly 100 years later by an Irish architect. So most of old Montreal was built during the British regime. Therefore, from a immigrant perspective, we, the non-Francophones, those who do not have roots going back to the pre-conquest era, we feel that we have contributed, that we have co-created this modern society. And there was a great comment at a screening at Casa d'Italia for the Francophone community, where one of the people in the audience said, when I pick up friends at the airport and I drive through downtown Montreal, I say, look at those skyscrapers. He said, Italians built those. He said, now Italians own them. And that sense of we contributed to build this, and now we're taking our place, and this should be recognized. And that came up again and again. We don't want to say we're better. We just want to say we're here. We contributed. Why can't we all sort of share that pride together? And so that's what the book is about. There's a sort of duality between the frustration of what's going on, and on the other hand, we like Quebec. That's why we're here. There's so much good about it. And our personal relationships with our friends and our neighbors, many of us are married to Francophones. There's all of that is extremely positive. And that's what is being forgotten. And that is very dangerous.
Totally. And we can coexist. I mean, we've been doing it for a long time, but I agree with you. Some of these bills and laws that come in really feel like suppressive in nature, in that, can we forget about, and that's why I felt that your book was so interesting, is that you're putting your hand down and saying, no, we can't forget about these things. We have to learn our histories.
And there are just some vindictive things. I mean, there's an entire chapter in the book with youth, because, many of the people who came to the film are boomers, slightly older, slightly younger. But I visited 2 high schools, CEGEPs, and all 3 universities. And so I wanted their view to be expressed. Now, 15 or 20 years ago, when I would talk to a university group about language, they'd roll their eyes and go, oh, come on, that's such a boomer thing, Right? We speak French, we speak many languages. We don't care about language. We're concerned about the environment, we're concerned about justice, we're concerned about, many things. And yet, when I was touring the film during that whole Bill 96, that attack on the schools, I saw the sheer vindictiveness of the legislation. There was one very good example. A woman who teaches at Marianopolis said that for the CEGEPs, they were given quotas. And it's very complex to plan the exact number of students we're going to enroll. Lots of people apply, you choose them. Some that you choose have already gone somewhere else. So let's say your quota is 100. You're going to be 110, 95. You're going to be up or down a little bit. The legislation was built to be lose-lose. If you go over your quota, you're penalized, $15,000 per student. If you play safe and go under your quota, the government can say, well, you didn't use your quota, so we're going to reduce it. I mean, it's definitely just maliciously designed to be lose-lose. And it blindsided the schools, and to what end? And so the kids understood that. I mean, the kids that I talked to were saying, one, for example, a kid from Ontario who said, I've always just been crazy about Quebec. I thought it was Montreal was the coolest city in Canada. But I came here, I did a stage, and I'm getting the sense that, there's a lot of, I would be unwelcome here. I don't know if I'd have a future here. So this is a kid who's kind of been dreaming his whole life about coming to Quebec, being a teacher. I mean, do we need teachers? The kid feels that he doesn't have a future here as a teacher. I mean, that's shocking.
Yeah. Well, that's crazy. That's crazy. Well, Guy, this has been very short, but tons of history that we've covered. I would definitely love to have you come back and continue this conversation, because we have to keep history alive, and we have to learn from it as well. And I think that your stories and your connection with that history makes us all a lot smarter. So I appreciate your time.
Well, thank you, Chris. I'd just like to say to your leaders, to your listeners, that all of this stuff is available on the new website, whatwechoose.ca. You can get the film, you can get the YouTube link. There are 2 electronic versions of the book, a PDF and an EPUB. They're free of charge. I mean, obviously, I have to charge for the book because there are costs. And also, we haven't even talked very much about the whole education research project that I'm doing, but all of that documentation is on the same website. So if people are interested in what they've heard now, they can go and follow up a lot of material on the website. So whatwechoose.ca is all there.
Amazing. I'll definitely put that in the show descriptor as well, so you have a quick link to it. And also, Guy, I wanted to there are resources for schools too, right, that you have made available as well.
For the film, yeah. So on the film's website, which is a separate link, there are teachers' resources, yes. Yeah. Because I saw one class where we showed the entire film, and like having kids sit still without their phones for 93 minutes was like torture. So we don't want to torture kids. We don't want to turn them off history. So we've broken the film down into little units that can be approached from different angles, historical activities, make a podcast, talk to your grandparents. So yeah, there are all kinds of tools there on the film's website that have been designed and apparently work very well in the classroom.
Amazing. Well, I'll include those. Teachers out there, listeners out there, please go and have a look at this information and what Guy's been working on. And I would love to have you come back once your new projects are kind of hitting the road, and we can continue this.
Absolutely. Would love to. So thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, Guy.
Okay. Bye-bye.